Hello, and welcome to Chicanime. It says Chicago Reacts back here because I broke all of the things. So, we're rebuilding, but things might be a little bit wonky for a little while, so I appreciate y'all's patience with me on that one. And again, I'm sorry. I know that there's just going to be some weird scheduling stuff, and there's going to be some weird backgrounds, and the audio might be a little bad. And I do not have the list of patrons going up at the end, but fear not, we do still appreciate all of the patrons. So I will just give a couple shout outs here. So thanks to Illuminant Brain, thank you to Acros26, Christopher Turner, 194, CDR, or Carl. Thanks to Carl. Oh, I fucked that one up, didn't I? I did. Hello and welcome to Chicanime. I know that it says Chicago Reacts back there, but that's because I broke everything. Don't move your files around without knowing where they go to, kids. That is what I've learned. So now we basically have to rebuild everything. Which means that right now, things are a little bit weird. Audio's going to be a little bit off. I got the background is different, and I can't do the usual intros. So sorry for all of that. I did want to give a shout out to a couple of patrons though, because I will not be able to have the list going up at the end for a minute. So thank you to M10th, Sequoia, Stephen Burns, Christopher Turner, Toten Cruiz, Carl Rigney, Illuminant Brain, Charles Link, Casper Brunn, Jose Ferrer, let's see, Starscream, Roski, and Austin Wilcox. So, a bunch of people. So, thank you so much for supporting the channel. And again, I apologize. I know things are a little bit weird right now, so I'm working on it, trying to make that better. But today, we are going to be looking at the 5 worst overlords in... Or the 5 worst in Overlord. Oh, that's thanks Stitch, too. I feel like Stitch has been watching a lot of this Overlord stuff. So, thank you so much. So this is Nazaric's Worst and Most Evil NPCs, Part 1. This is from Annie News. I've been enjoying looking at some of my Overlord nonsense. It's been a lot of fun to get sort of a backstory and background information on a lot of these characters. So I'm looking forward to this. I hope you're looking forward to it as well. And let's begin.
Exists a small group of Did you know there exists a small group of NPCs in Nazarick that are so terrifying, so hideous, so evil, that they're affiliated together to form the 5 worst? Worst at what exactly, though?
Everything.
Well, each are definitively the worst in their own categories.
Oh,
we have the worst
okay.
Occupation, worst residence, worst appearance, worst personality, and worst hero. Normally, I'd talk-
Hero. What is Eero? Oh, tell me what Eero is. I am certain. I feel like the worst appearance is probably that weird slug thing. That with the makeup and stuff. That thing was weird.
Talk about all 5 in one typical 20-minute video. But there's one character from the worst who deserves her own spotlight.
Oh, okay.
The real best girl of Overlord.
Okay.
The most thick being in Nazarick.
Yeah, the horrible.
So let's spend an entire video talking about the beautiful creature that bears the title of Worst Occupation.
This is the one I would...
First, I'm happy to unveil the second design in the Bay merch.
That's pretty cool too. But I think, okay, so I think I was right. The worst is definitely that thing.
The Nabe design. Cause we all know she's way better than Albedo. But still not as good as Nurinist. So feel free to check it out with the Teespring link in the description.
I do love Nabe.
Now, let's begin. Of the 5 worst, the second worst is Nurinist Painkill, the worst occupation. Yeah, let's just go with she on this one. She's Nazarick's resident full-time torturer. Not to be
I can't believe that they're... Okay, I like that they are giving Nurinist a video all to herself. I love that. That's fantastic. But also, I definitely thought she was going to be the worst.
Fused with Kyohuko, who occasionally moonlights as one. Apparently her actual job title is Special Intelligence Collector.
Torturer. Well,
Definitely a big difference. She's a level 23 brain eater who resides on the 5th floor of Nazarick, the frozen glacier, in a place called the Room of Truth, located in the frozen prison where prisoners of Nazarick are have their special intelligence collected while in the Room of Truth. Yeah, I bet you're sensing a pattern in the use of euphemisms here. After all,
you gotta use those euphemisms. Everyone does it, darling.
Neuronist's thing is that she's extremely effeminate and seductive, despite being a terrifying monstrosity that could never be seen as either. We see something like this in Kyokuko, who comes across as rational and reasonable, up until he decides you'd serve him best as a meal for his cockroaches.
Ugh.
It feels like
I really hated that episode. I didn't hate that episode, but I hated seeing certain things in that episode. It's very unnerving to me, and literally, both of those things are actual nightmares that I've had. Not looking specifically like that, but in that similar vein, both of those things are actual nightmares that I've had.
Dan is a big fan of Gap horror, kind of like Gap Moe, but for horror instead. You know, when they act in a way that is completely contradictory to their appearance. So in a horror sense, basically something that's mostly scary that has an element to it which is normally not very frightening, but which ends up enhancing the horror rather than reducing it. In any case, her personality and mannerisms are a near-identical copy of Albedo, replete with copious uses of the phrase ara, which roughly translates to oh my, and is a common way to signify a mature woman in her mid-20s to early 30s, who comes across as faintly seductive but also innocent at the same time. Now, quite unlike Albedo,
is it me?
Who can be quite reserved, Neuronist Painkill takes the fetishization of sexualization up to 11 out of 10. She wears a fetishistic BDSM outfit, covers herself with lovely perfume, regularly uses sexual euphemisms, and fantasizes about Ainz's beastly gaze and how she'd love to one day sleep with him. Ugh. But given her revolting body and disturbing voice, which in the light novel is said to be distorted to the point that no one can even tell whether Neuronist is male or female, these actions do the opposite of making her alluring and attractive. They really only serve to exacerbate how utterly revolting she is.
And that's interesting too, because people, pretty privilege, certainly a thing. So people who act the exact same way, but one of them is gorgeous and one of them is horrifying. And it's when you see the horrifying one doing it, you realize how actually horrifying the behavior is. But if you see the pretty person doing it, then you kind of give them a pass. And it's and I feel like I've been really, really hard on Albedo for the entire time. Also, I've been hard on Ainz for what he did to Albedo, and I don't know, I feel like if someone is uncomfortable with those, with what you're doing, then someone's uncomfortable. And that means that your behavior needs to change. And Albedo does not change her behavior, even though, again, Ainz or Momonga hardwired it into her. But the point being, if something is horrible when an ugly person does it, it's also horrible when a pretty person does it, and we need to not let the pretty person get away with it.
On top of this, her mannerisms seem like nothing more than a disguise for her true personality. One of a torturer who delights in causing as much pain as possible, replete with a negative 425 karma rating to boot.
Dang!
She speaks in sly euphemisms, suggesting that her victims are to join a choir and sing to the glories of Ainzul Gon and the Supreme Ones, which of course isn't the case. The singing would be the screams induced by having a thin spiked rod shoved into their unmentionables.
Yeah.
It's an act that seems to be designed to lure them into a false sense of comfort, serving to enhance the panic that they feel when they find out what she's really talking about.
I feel like there's no way you wouldn't be panicked no matter what that thing said to you, unless she manages to put out some kind of weird aura that allows you to immediately get past what she looks like.
Of course, I say act as if to imply that she's merely pretending, but as an NPC, she can be created with basically any personality, regardless of how contradictory or absurd. It was her creator who set her to behave this way in order to maximize the horror. Her creator who intended to have her act this way. She seems to think that she's far more beautiful than Shalltear or Albedo. Perhaps she also truly believes that torture-induced produced screams make for the best kind of choir too. Maybe even the purpose behind that delusion is to magnify the sense of terror. As C.S. Lewis once said, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive.
I was not expecting a wild C.S. Lewis quote in here. What?
Then again, like most evil NPCs, she finds humans and other creatures not from Nazarick to be vile, disgusting creatures, and seems to relish in causing them suffering if given the opportunity. So it could very well be that she's quite aware of the stark contrast between her personality, words, and actions. As for her build now, she's a member of the Brain Eater race, a heteromorphic
Honestly, it's not so horrible, like in this image.
god from the fictional mythos created by H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft's horror was themed around the unknowable, elder gods that were said to be interdimensional beings whose true nature could never be understood, for to attempt to do so would eventually drive one insane. So, as you'd expect, they were often the subject of praise by deranged and insane cultists who worshipped them fanatically. Interactions with them were frequently a Faustian bargain, a deal with the devil if you will. One that would eventually prove to be a mistake in the long run when the bargainer was then forced to sacrifice everything. The intent was to evoke a kind of existential terror, a sense of unease brought on by uncertainty and the unknown.
Oh, that was a cool door handle with like the little like tentacle. I liked that.
Often associated with the thoughts of one's fundamental mortality and fragility as a human being. Incidentally, one of the best ways to describe Overlord is a Lovecraft parody, a topic that could very well get its own video at one point. Now,
That could be cool.
Back to the Brain Eaters, it's not clear what mechanical properties they have, though when referenced in fantasy fiction, their bewitching nature is often translated as a penchant for spellcasting ability, psionics, and mind control spells. In fact, Dungeons & Dragons has a race of creatures called Illithid, also known as Mind Flayers. These creatures would use their powerful psionic abilities to stun or mind control their enemies, and then either drag them away to literally suck out their brains, or simply employ them as slaves and thralls.
So you know that this video is old because there's nothing from Baldur's Gate 3 in here at all. Like, if this video had come out in the past, 6 months, you know for a fact there would be Baldur's Gate references and, images of... I did watch a trailer for Baldur's Gate, so maybe I'll link that somewhere, but...
Regardless of whether Brain Eaters are psionic specialists or just general spellcasters, it's clear they have some utility in a spellcasting build. It's also good to know that it's believed that the Supreme One, Tabula Smaragdina, shares the same race. I mean, the visual similarities are pretty obvious, and he too was a spellcaster.
Okay.
But we have all this talk of spellcaster, yet we still don't know what type of spellcasting class Neuronist is. So, what class is she? Well, she was a cleric, or more specifically, one that had a breakdown of levels in Bishop, Doctor, Hand of God, and one other mystery class.
Oh.
Bishops are of course higher-ranking clerics, and Hand of God may be even higher than that still. The higher ranked the cleric, the higher tier of magic they could access. Their spells are powered through faith in a deity, an ideology, or whatever. Strong, devout faith itself is sufficient, regardless of whether they believe in something real or not.
Like orcs. Okay. Oh, so her belief is in Ainz then. Or maybe Ainz, maybe Momonga specifically / Ainz, but maybe just all of the Supreme Ones.
Author of Overlord, Maruyama, through the character of Ainz, applies a rather atheistic view of divine spellcasting. In traditional Dungeons & Dragons, from which Overlord takes many of its fantasy mechanics, a cleric actually communes with a small part of an actual god, who in return gives them a small fraction of divine power, and expects them to act as their proxy to influence the world. But in traditional Japanese Shintoism, and in lots of fantasy settings in general, acts of faith, belief, and prayer itself are often said to make gods and or fantasy beings more powerful. And in return for giving the god power through devout faith, the gods return that faith with blessings of their own.
Oh, that's really interesting. I love that. I always like stories where gods and humans have a slightly more symbiotic relationship like that, where the humans kind of give the gods their power by having that faith. So the more, there's been some like interesting stories that are like, you know, the gods, or I think like American Gods had that sort of mentality where it's like the older gods were falling more out of power because people weren't worshiping them anymore, but at the same time it's like they were still pretty established and were able to keep a hold of it. I think it's been a while since I've read American Gods, but the idea being humans kind of create these gods and give them the powers that they have, so then the gods are then in turn able to help the humans out. And I think that's interesting, as opposed to like a god that exists and then expects that, you know, faith in that worship because they exist. I don't know. Look, woo, let's not get into religion right now. I think maybe is probably the best bet here. Yeah, we're not going to talk about that. It's complicated. TLDR, I like it when the relationship is more symbiotic, or at least there's the potential that if the god gets, you know, too assholey, the humans could just stop worshiping them and then reduce their power. I think that's interesting. I think that's cool.
I assume this is similar to how the mechanics of Goblin Slayer's blessings work, performing a chant of worship to their god in exchange for a blessing of strength or power. Maruyama's take is a twist on that interpretation. The faith does not power the god, who then proceeds to grant the believer power. The faith itself is an expression of power, and need not pass through any intermediary. After all, clerics are capable of casting spells about as fast as wizards are. And that isn't exactly conducive with the theory that you're sitting there waiting around for your prayers to be answered by a god in some other dimension. As for the remaining classes, a doctor may be a healing magic specialist. Clerics generally had a balance of buffs, healing, and attack spells, so a doctor might be specialized specifically towards boosting healing magic. Or, more likely, it probably helped with the treatment of wounds, poisons, and diseases without the use of magic spells, though such a treatment would obviously be much slower and weaker than magic in exchange for not costing any MP. Now, you might be wondering, why would a torturer need a set of healing spells?
Because you need to be able to bring the person you're torturing back to health so you can start again. Ding. Ding.
Well, you can't get information from a dead person, just like how you can't feed the residents of Demiurge's Happy Farm without their supply of food, if you know what I mean. I'll clarify in a little bit.
No, you don't have to.
On the other hand, one could just make or buy scrolls which allow them to cast a spell once without expending any MP, or even wands which allow them to cast that spell multiple times before running out of charges. So why they would want to pick a class in a video game that is forced to use much slower methods like bandages or herbs is a bit of a mystery. The benefits are pretty minuscule as they only entail moderately lower costs, but the drawbacks are dramatically less potency and dramatically slower healing, so I don't entirely see the value of the trade. But that's pretty much all I could gather from her build. As for her name itself, Neuronist Painkill, those could be references to the English words neuron and painkiller. The former is the name of the nerves that comprise your brain, and the latter is the name of the medicine that reduces pain. They are probably just references to her brain eater race and doctor vocation, though they could also be subtle understatements. Neuronist sounds nicer than brain eater, a race that literally eats your brains, and painkiller is pretty much the exact opposite of what she actually does. Though keep in mind, it may not be useful to try and read too heavily into the meaning of these words. Japan sometimes borrows English words that sound cool to them instead of using the Japanese equivalent, and oftentimes, they'll accidentally change the definition or the spelling of the word in the process, like neuron into neuronist and painkiller into painkill, so her name may just be another example of that. Now that you know a little bit more about her character,
I guess we'll never know.
You might be wondering what a religious minister, psionic specialist, and doctor have to do with torturing. Torturer wasn't
think about the Spanish Inquisition, right? Like, they were religious torturers.
A normal function or class that one could actually fulfill back in Yggdrasil. More likely, it was a product of her biography which became real once Nazarick was transported into the New World. In Yggdrasil, NPCs mostly just stood around wherever they were placed and fought intruders. So how does one create a torturer specialist in Nazarick? Well, as I was previously referring to, if you remember in our Demiurge video, any good torturer needs to be able to heal their victims. After all, the purpose of torture is to cause torment and suffering, not death. But it's hard to torture someone if you constantly have to keep worrying about accidentally killing them. If you injured them too severely, you'd have to stop the torture and wait for them to heal for a few days or weeks before you could do it again.
Boring!
But with healing spells, that problem virtually disappears, and you're free to repeatedly torture someone to the verge of death and then heal them back up again. It's efficiency at its finest. You may also be interested to know that Nuranis did not work alone. To assist her in her endeavors, she's served by a selection of 4 minions, known only as torturers. They were cut from the anime, so we'll just go with the light novel's description. They wore tight black leather aprons. Their bodies were not so much white as cream-colored. Below that skin were, if blood could be purple, purplish blood vessels. Their heads were covered in seamless black leather masks. There was no telling how they could see or even breathe. Their arms were also very long. Each of them was about 2 meters tall, but their arms extended down below their knees, and the belts at their waists contained countless work tools. So yeah, she had 4 helping hands, which makes sense I guess for a torturer. I mean, I guess you can't exactly torture someone 24/7 all by yourself. How else would you eat and sleep? I think the more important benefit from having torturing assistants is the ability to cause pain to multiple different areas of the body, instead of just one area at a time, or even just torture multiple people at once. Now, just add on top of that a selection of psionic attacks that can mess with your mind, as well as healing magic that can restore any injuries back to full health, and I think you have a pretty good recipe for eternal suffering and existential terror. But the next member of the 5 worst might just have Nuranist Painkill beat on that front, if you can even believe that's possible. Unfortunately though, that will have to be in the next video, where I go over the remaining 4 members of the 5 worst. Now, before I go, a huge thank you to Bakuretsu for designing the Nabe merch for me. Once again, it's a minimalistic style that still highlights the essence of the character. You can get both this design and the Succube design through the links in the description. Anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!
Okay. Great. That was one of the videos about one of the worst NPC in Overlord. I'm very curious to see where else they're gonna go and like who else they're going to talk about. Because that's interesting. Oh, it's interesting that I think this playlist has some like they've moved some things around, because the Demiurge video is pretty far down. But I have already watched the Demiurge videos. But those are pretty far down. This one was 5 years ago. So anyway, so I got another one of these, and then we're gonna move on to Albedo after that. So yeah, look, I'm just gonna go down in the order of this playlist, regardless of the fact that things are maybe a little bit moved around. But I thank you for watching these. I hope that y'all are still enjoying it. I certainly am. So I can't wait to see what happens next, and I'll catch you in the next video. Bye bye.